Okay, let's start very quickly. I want to welcome each and every one of you. I want to believe you are all hearing me now loud and clear. Welcome to our training on humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. It's coming from the African College of Crisis Management and Peacebuilding, ACCMP. The African College of Crisis Management and Peacebuilding, ACCMP, is the training and capacity building arm of the Institute for Crisis Resolution, Peacebuilding and Conciliation, based here in Abuja. My name is Dr. Abdul Wahid Odewale, and by the grace of God, I will be your facilitator for this all-important leadership course on humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. For the next 3 days, starting from today, we shall be handling and treating this comprehensive 10-module course that is produced by the Training Center of ICRPC. And it is intended to equip us with the ethics, skills, and frameworks to advance equitable humanitarian governance worldwide. So once again, I welcome you all, and we shall be going into the training fully. We'll start by looking at what we intend to cover today so that we can start fully. Now, looking at this very course, if you look at your screen, you will see that the topic itself is on humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. Very important course. We all know that all over the world, there are various kinds of humanitarian crises that comes from aftermath of conflict, humanitarian crisis that arises from, forced migration, conflict situations, various kinds of wars that happen in various parts of the world, humanitarian crisis from flood, and also humanitarian crisis that emanates from various forms of disasters all over the world. So we are going to look at how humanitarian leadership and global equity governance is very important as far as this course is concerned. The first thing I want us to do is that, I want us to know is that this course contains 10 modules that we shall be treating extensively for the next 3 days. Module 1 actually will be focusing on foundations of humanitarian leadership and global equity. We will look at module 2, where we will also discuss global humanitarian systems and governance architecture. And of course, module 3 too, we will look at leadership ethics, values, and decision-making in humanitarian context. We will also proceed to module 4, where we will look at equity, inclusion, and social justice in humanitarian action. These are the course outline. And of course, module 5, we will be looking at humanitarian leadership in conflict and fragile settings. That will be effectively handled in module 5. And of course, it will take us to module 6, where we will look at localization, partnerships, and shared leadership. That will be properly handled in module 6. And of course, module 7, we will look at crisis leadership, coordination, and adaptive management. And module 8, we will look at humanitarian financing, accountability, and global equity. Module 9 will touch on technology, innovation, and future humanitarian leadership. And of course, module 10, we will be looking at personal and institutional action for equitable humanitarian leadership. Once again, I welcome you. This particular training is free, coming from the African College of Crisis Management and Peacebuilding. You can only maybe decide to have the certificate of this training, which is coming for a token of 20,000 naira for those who may want to have it, and to actually solidify this training and to justify the need for it, it comes with 10 CPD units, that is Continuum Professional Development Unit, which makes this very course very important and can be used for career progression. The first question I want us to quickly get, which will serve as the foundation to what we intend to do today. We need to understand, what is humanitarian leadership? What is humanitarian leadership? We'll break it down very well. We will need to know what humanitarian leadership means. And of course, we'll also define what we mean by equity governance. You know, humanitarian leadership, we'll look at equity governance. And of course, we'll have to look at the differences, and we have to now get some combined meaning to this. The first aspect, humanitarian leadership is actually the ability to guide, coordinate, and inspire people and organizations to respond effectively to human suffering, to respond effectively to human crises, to respond effectively to disasters, conflicts, poverty, and emergencies, while protecting human dignity and promoting peace and development. That is humanitarian leadership. You will agree with me that humanitarian crises that emanate from conflicts, from poverty and emergencies require coordination, it requires a response, and it requires a high level of humanitarian leadership. If you have crises in various fields or in various sectors as a result of suffering and as a result of conflict, if these humanitarian responses are not well coordinated, then the desired objective will not be achieved. So humanitarian leadership actually is that ability to guide and coordinate and even inspire people and organizations to respond effectively to human suffering. You know, ability to respond effectively to crises, disasters, conflict, poverty, and even emergencies, while protecting human dignity and even promoting peace and development. So humanitarian leadership, in a nutshell, actually, it focuses on saving lives, it focuses on reducing suffering, protecting vulnerable people, and even promoting justice, peace, and human welfare. You know, so coordinating relief and even recovery efforts. That is what humanitarian leadership focuses on. Focuses on saving lives, reducing suffering, protecting vulnerable people, promoting justice, peace, and human welfare, and coordinating relief and recovery efforts. So humanitarian leaders actually are those who are expected to demonstrate some level of compassion. They are expected to demonstrate integrity. They are expected to demonstrate crisis management skills, conflict management skills, and even cultural sensitivity. They are also expected to demonstrate accountability and strategic thinking. You know, so that is what we mean in summary by humanitarian leadership. Yes, now we can look at some examples where we talk about examples of humanitarian leadership can be seen. It can be seen in organizations like the United Nations. It can be seen in organizations like International Committee of the Red Cross, even organizations like the African Union, during war, during a refugee crisis, during pandemics, during floods, and even peace missions. These are examples of humanitarian leadership that can be seen in organizations. Now, let's look at the next aspect that talks about equity governance. Don't forget that this course itself is talking about humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. So having described and explained what we mean by humanitarian leadership, let us look at equity governance. You know, what is equity governance? It is, it actually refers to a system of a leadership, a system of policies and decision making that ensures fairness, that ensures inclusion and equal opportunity and justice for all people, especially marginalized or disadvantaged groups. Yes, that is what we mean by equity governance. Don't forget that during crises, whenever they happen, humanitarian crisis, whenever it occurs, it do not affect everybody proportionately. Yes, there are people who have been affected disproportionately during the humanitarian crisis. And these are people who are the poor people, marginalized groups, are actually being affected disproportionately and what have you. So that is the reason why there must be equity governance, which involves a system whereby leadership and policies and decision making will ensure fairness, inclusion, equal opportunity, and even justice for all people, especially marginalized or disadvantaged groups. We can see during the COVID-19 crisis, you will agree with me that there was no equity governance. The rich were able to have better access to vaccines and even better access to healthcare than the poor people and even the marginalized people. So equity governance actually aims to reduce inequality. Equity governance aims to reduce inequality and tries to ensure that there's fair access to resources and opportunities, promote social justice, protect human rights, and even includes all groups in decision making, regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, age, or even disability, or even social status. So equity governance focuses on questions like, are resources distributed fairly? Yes, are resources distributed fairly? And questions like, do all groups have equal opportunities during humanitarian crisis, and all those who are actually exposed to, those who are vulnerable, are they all having equal opportunities? Are the resources that are supposed to reduce suffering during humanitarian crisis, are these resources distributed fairly? Are vulnerable populations protected? Is the leadership or the equity leadership, the humanitarian leadership, is it inclusive and is it accountable? So some of the key principles that we should look at in terms of equity governance is the aspect that involves fairness. Equity governance tries to work on the principles of inclusion, principles of transparency, principles of accountability, participation, equal access, and even social justice. These are some of that is what we mean by equity governance. Now, having looked at leadership, humanitarian leadership, and we have looked at equity governance, the next question you may need to ask yourself, what are the simple differences between the two? Because humanitarian leadership actually focuses on responding to human suffering and crisis. But equity governance actually focuses on what? Fairness and justice in governance. So while humanitarian leadership looks at emergency and development oriented, equity governance actually looked at policy and institutional orientation. So these are some of the differences. In addition to the fact that humanitarian leadership actually protects vulnerable people during crisis, but equity governance ensures equal opportunities and representation. These are some of the things that we need to quickly. So when combined together, you will, which is what this course is talking about, humanitarian leadership and equity governance. It means it is all about leading people and institutions. When you lead people and institutions in a compassionate, ethical, and inclusive way that protects human dignity while ensuring fairness, justice, and equal opportunities for all members of society. So you will agree with me that the concept of humanitarian leadership and global equity governance is highly relevant. It is relevant to peace building. It is relevant to youth development. It is relevant to conflict resolution, and also relevant to disaster response and even African development. So these are some of the things that we need to, first of all, have at the back of our mind as we progress with this particular course. We will now, these are the preambles. So first of all, let us look at the introduction, the first module, talking about the foundations of humanitarian leadership and global governance. The foundations of humanitarian leadership and global governance. Very important. Just like we have established now, humanitarian leadership today actually operates in an increasingly complex world. Humanitarian leadership, it operates in a complex world that is shaped by conflict, it is shaped by climate change, it is shaped by inequality, displacement, pandemics, and geopolitical tension. So effective humanitarian leaders must not only respond to crisis, but they must also address the structural inequalities that shape vulnerability and access to resources. That means if you are a crisis and disaster risk manager, you should also see yourself as a humanitarian leader. And as a humanitarian leader, you should not just only respond to crisis when they occur, or humanitarian crisis when they occur. You should also see how you can address some of the structural inequalities that shape vulnerability, because people are vulnerable in different ways. They are most vulnerable in our society. The most vulnerable in our society are the poor, the disadvantaged people, disadvantaged minorities, and sometimes women and children. So these people must have access, equal access, fair access to resources, and fair access to interventions. That is what we are talking about. So the whole idea is this first module here is trying to let us know the concept of global equity governance and how it works. Looking at an aspect here that is very important, understanding humanitarian leadership in a changing world. How do we understand humanitarian leadership in a world that is changing? Because as a humanitarian leader, you should realize that humanitarian leadership goes beyond management or even technical expertise, because it also involves moral responsibility toward affected populations. It also involves decision making under pressure and uncertainty. As a humanitarian leader, you are going to be under some form of pressure and uncertainty, and you have to navigate political, cultural, and even ethical complexities. And you must also know how to balance urgency with accountability. In a nutshell, modern humanitarian leaders must work across borders. You must work across borders, work across sectors and even cultures, while upholding humanitarian values. There are some aspects that we quickly need to know. There's what we call, key characteristics of effective humanitarian leader. What are the key characteristics of an effective humanitarian leader? We'll quickly look at that. The first one is integrity and ethical judgment. Humanitarian leadership must be characterized by integrity and ethical judgment. It must also be characterized by cultural sensitivity and inclusiveness, meaning that as a humanitarian leader, you must be inclusive in all your actions, in all your decision making, and you must be culturally sensitive to the affected communities. That's very important. And there's another characteristic is collaboration and partnership building. Humanitarian leaders must be collaborative, and they must be willing to collaborate, to partner with local actors. And of course, there must be adaptability in crisis situations. So what we are trying to say is that some of these are the 4 key characteristics of effective humanitarian leadership: integrity and ethical judgment, cultural sensitivity and inclusiveness, collaboration and partnership building, and also adaptability in crisis situation. So that means if you are the type that actually faints in the face of crisis, or if you are the type that gets completely scared in the face of crisis, you cannot be an effective humanitarian leader. Now let's look at core humanitarian principles. What are the core humanitarian principles? Because we should know that humanitarian action is guided by 4 universally recognized principles. If you do not know, please know this now. Very, very important. Humanitarian action is actually guided. It is guided by 4 universally recognized principles. Now, what are these principles? What are these principles? It is the principle of what? Humanity, the principle of neutrality, the principle of impartiality, and the principle of what? Independence. These are the 4 universally recognized principles or core principles of humanitarianism. Now, looking at the first one, which is the principle of humanity. Humanity actually means what? It means addressing human suffering whenever it is found. with the goal of protecting life and dignity. That is the principle of humanity. The first one, addressing human suffering wherever it is found, with the goal of protecting life and dignity. The second principle is the principle of neutrality. The principle of neutrality looks at what? Not taking sides. Not taking sides in hostilities. Not taking sides in hostilities or political or even religious or ideological disputes. If no matter the nature of the dispute, whether it is religious, whether it is political or ideological, a core humanitarian leader must not take sides. He must be neutral. That is one of the second universally recognized principles. The third one is impartiality. That is why we are talking about humanitarian leadership. He must provide assistance based on need alone, without any form of discrimination. And that's why we are still talking about equity governance. Any form of discrimination betrays the concept of equity governance. So, therefore, it is very important that humanitarian leaders must look at the third core humanitarian principle of impartiality. And the fourth one is what? Independence. Independence has to do with what? Maintaining autonomy. Yes, maintaining autonomy from political, military, or economic interests. Because these principles are essential for maintaining trust, access, and even legitimacy in humanitarian context. That is what we are talking about. 4 core principles. Now let us quickly move to another very important aspect, which we will be looking at, is the concept of a global equity. What is the meaning of global equity? Even though I have actually explained it from the beginning, but we should look at its relevance and even its moral imperatives. Because global equity, just like we have said, it has to do with fairness, fairness in access to resources, fairness to opportunities, fairness in access to protection and decision making across countries and populations. That means fairness in the way people are given opportunity to access resources, access protection, and decision making. That is what we mean by global equity. So, and why does global equity, why does it matter? It matters because crises, just like I've said, even from the beginning, crises disproportionately affect the poorest and the most marginalized. So, humanitarian crises, take it from me, do not affect everybody equally or in the same way. And that is why global equity matters. And we have seen that historical and structural inequalities shape vulnerability. When you have structural inequalities like poverty, people who are poor are already structurally vulnerable. They are already vulnerable as a result of their poor state, as a result of their poverty. So we all know that structural inequalities like poverty and even marginalization, and even sometimes when you have gender inequality, these are structural inequalities that actually can even shape the way a particular group of people are vulnerable to crisis. And of course, another reason why global equity matters is unequal power relations. When there's unequal power relationship, who can influence humanitarian priorities and funding. So what we must know is that humanitarian leadership must confront inequities. As a humanitarian leader, you must confront any form of inequality and inequity within both affected societies and the global humanitarian system itself. Because there's a global humanitarian system, which we are going to look at. Yes. Now, we also quickly need to look at another important aspect, which has to do with the aspect of power, privilege, and also inequality in humanitarian systems. You know that humanitarian systems often reflect global power imbalances. We have global humanitarian systems, we have national humanitarian systems, and even local humanitarian systems. All of them are very, very important in ensuring that we have an equitable global equity system. Now, let us look at some challenges, evolving challenges in humanitarianism, evolving humanitarian challenges. Humanitarian leaders should, face overlapping and compounding crises. Yes, Humanitarian leaders face overlapping and compounding crisis. What are the challenges? Including, and one of them is protracted conflicts and fragile states. When we have protracted conflicts and fragile states, climate-induced disasters and displacement, pandemics and public health emergencies, and even urbanization and mass migration. We have just been informed that there is a resurgence of Ebola virus in the Congo DRC. That is going to be another form of humanitarian crisis. That is going to cause another form of a pandemic. So some of the challenges that that involving humanitarian challenges we are talking about is when conflicts are protracted, because the whole idea is to ensure that conflicts do not last for too long. Conflicts do not continue. And when conflicts are continuously, are protracted conflict and fragile states, it becomes a challenge for humanitarian leaders. And when you have some climate-induced disasters, there are some kind of climate-induced disasters and displacement that can be very critical, that can be very terrible and very disastrous. So this becomes a humanitarian challenge. Pandemics, like the kind of COVID-19 pandemic that we talked about, and public health emergencies. Now we are, and also when you even have urbanization, you have mass migration. These are evolving humanitarian challenges. Now let us quickly look at, before we, to round up module 1 of this training, we'll look at the roles of key stakeholders in humanitarian leadership. When we are looking at key stakeholders, we are talking about the government as a stakeholder. We are looking at civil society, the CSOs as stakeholders. We are looking at youth leaders, and we are looking at the private sector. These are the 4 key stakeholders in humanitarian leadership. What are their roles? The first one is the government. The government can play a good role by setting up policy frameworks and even coordination mechanisms. The government can ensure protection of civilians and even humanitarian assets, and they can even integrate equity into national response strategies. That is the role that the government can play in humanitarian leadership, when they infuse and integrate governance equity into our national response strategies. What about CSOs? CSOs can play very important role in delivering frontline services. CSO can play another role of advocating for marginalized populations. When people are marginalized, and people are sidelined in terms of their access to protection, access to resources, access to help and emergency, during emergencies. CSOs can play a good role to advocate for marginalized populations and also to even bridge communities and institutions. Then we look at youth leaders. Youth leaders can also, as a stakeholder, can also play the role of mobilizing communities and innovation, and they can also promote inclusion and accountability, and even shape future humanitarian leadership. The private sector, of course, as a key stakeholder, can play the role of providing logistics. Private sector can provide logistics, technology, and financing. Yes, these are the roles of key stakeholders in humanitarian leadership. Private sector can also support innovation and even rapid response, and even apply ethical business practices in crisis context. So what we are trying to say in a nutshell is that effective humanitarian leadership depends on collaboration across these actors. Effective humanitarian leadership depends on collaboration across the government, collaboration across civil society organizations, youth leaders, and private sector. Now, let us quickly look at a case study as far as Module 1 is concerned. We are talking about equity challenges. These are the equity challenges during the COVID-19 humanitarian response. We all agree with me that during COVID-19 pandemic, during COVID-19 pandemic, humanitarian responses actually revealed deep global inequities. Yes, the kind of humanitarian responses we saw during COVID-19, it revealed some level of global inequities, because we saw a high level of unequal access to vaccines between high and low income countries. Yes, that was a high level of global inequities. There was marginalization in, I mean, we have some marginalized communities facing a lot of barrier to healthcare. That was a very good example, the COVID-19. And we had limited participation of local actors in response planning. And why were we having limited participation of local actors? It's because of what? The global actors were not inclusive enough in terms of including local actors in the planning of these responses. These were some of the things we saw. So what are the leadership lessons that was learned during the equity challenges at the COVID-19 humanitarian response? One of them is that equity must be intentional. Equity must be what? Intentional. It must be embedded in crisis response, you know. And of course, local leadership improves effectiveness and trust. And we also know that global solidarity is essential for collective security. These are some of the things that we need to take into consideration as we progress. Now, for Module 1, what are the key takeaways? The key takeaways is that humanitarian leadership is grounded in ethics and values. Even if you have not been part of this training from the beginning, what you should know as you are just coming, because we have just rounded up Module 1. The first thing to take away from what we have discussed in Module 1 is that humanitarian leadership is grounded in ethics and values. Take note of that. And we said that number 2, humanitarian principles guide action in complex contexts, you know, because there are some principles, the humanitarian principles we talked about, that is what will guide your action. They call humanitarian principles of humanity, of neutrality, the principle of impartiality, and the principle of independence. These are the principles that guide action in complex situations. You know, so please take note of that. Then we also talked about power and inequality must be acknowledged and what? Addressed. Yes, during humanitarian response, humanitarian leadership must know that there is inequality in the society. There's structural imbalance. There is structural inequality. There are marginalized groups. There are poor. I mean, there are poor people. There's women and children. Also, they must be acknowledged and they must be addressed. And we know that finally, that collaboration across sectors with humanitarian outcomes. Yes, very important. Collaboration across sectors strengthens humanitarian outcomes. That takes us to the end of Module 1. We will be proceeding to Module 2. Module 2 here, we will be looking at the global humanitarian system and governance architecture. We all know that humanitarianism as a whole is a global orientation, and of course, most international organizations, even IGOs and NGOs, we have a lot of organizations that are humanitarian oriented. So we should also know today that humanitarian action does not actually occur in isolation. So in this Module 2, we'll be looking at the global humanitarian system, you know, the key actors in the coordination, in the mechanisms, and even the governance challenges. So all this will be looked at with a focus on equity, accountability, and leadership. So just like I've said, without taking much of our time, that humanitarian action does not occur in isolation. So it is shaped by a complex global governance architecture. This governance architecture involves international institutions, it involves national governments, civil society organizations, donors, and the private sector. These are the actors that make up the complex global governance architecture in terms of global governance, global humanitarian system. Yes. So we are going to look at how, we are going to understand how this global humanitarian system and governance architecture, how they function, you know, how this system function and where power and accountability lie, you know, because this is essential for effective humanitarian leadership and equitable governance. Without proper coordination, you will see that sometimes humanitarian action, humanitarian responses can lack coordination. When it lacks coordination, the impact will be less visible. the impact, and it could even be a waste of financial resources, physical and mental energy when it is not coordinated. So we should look at an overview of the global humanitarian system, because the global humanitarian system actually makes up of what? A network. It is a network of actors who are working to prevent, prepare for, and even respond to crisis that is caused by conflict. Anytime there's a conflict, anytime there's a disaster, anytime there's any form of forced migration or displacement, it brings about humanitarian crisis. And we have a network of actors whose job is to prevent, prepare for, and even respond to crises that emanates from humanitarian disasters. Now, what are the core objectives of these actors, this network of actors? This global humanitarian system, what core objectives do they have? There are just three objectives. One is to save lives and reduce suffering. Core objectives: saving lives and reducing what? Suffering. The second one is protect dignity and human rights. Very important. The third one is what? Support recovery and resilience. Meaning that we should be our brother's keeper. If there is a humanitarian crisis in a neighboring country to Nigeria, of course, Nigeria government and other actors, both the international organizations, international institutions, national government, civil society, and donors and the private sector must come together and provide some kind of a coordinated response to save lives and reduce suffering, to protect dignity and human rights, and to support recovery and resilience. So the system actually operates at a global, regional, national, and even local levels, and most times simultaneously. So that is an overview of the global humanitarian system. Now, there are some areas we need to find out quickly. That what are the key actors? Who are the key actors in humanitarian governance? The key actors in humanitarian governance, number one is the United Nations system. The United Nations system is a key actor in humanitarian governance because UN agencies play central roles. They play roles in coordination, in funding, and also implementation. Yes, you have various agencies like the OCHA, which have to do with overall humanitarian coordination and advocacy, still an agency of the UN. We also have the United Nations Humanitarian Coordination and Refugee Center. All this will have to do with protection of refugees and displaced persons. We have the World Food, the WFP, who are into food assistance and logistics. Then you have the UNICEF for child protection, health, and education. These are key UN agencies, that act as humanitarian governance system. Then look, what about national governments? The government of various countries. The host government lead national response frameworks. Like, for example, if there's a national disaster in Nigeria, the host government is the Nigerian government. Donor governments too form part of what? Donor government provide funding and political influence. Like, for example, a country like Cameroon can also actually help if there's a disaster in Nigeria or if there's a humanitarian crisis in Nigeria. Then government that also regulate humanitarian assets and operations. These come under the key actor of what? Government. Then we have international and national NGOs. These are other actors. They deliver frontline humanitarian assistance. They can even advocate for affected populations and even innovate in service delivery and community engagement. Another group of actors are the donors and financial institutions that help in providing funding and even set strategic priorities. They influence program design and even accountability requirements. Then the final actors are the private sector. The private sector can supply logistics, technology, and infrastructure, support innovation, and even financing mechanisms. These are the key actors in humanitarian governance. Now let us look at humanitarian coordination and mechanisms. Humanitarian coordination and mechanisms, very, very important, because we should know that it is not very important. It is not just about doing some humanitarian work. It is also key to ensure that humanitarian activities or humanitarian interventions are coordinated, because it is essential to avoid duplication, to avoid gaps, and even to avoid inequities. These are the reasons why effective coordination is very important. So we have some humanitarian coordination mechanisms, that are in place. The first one is humanitarian cluster system. It is a humanitarian coordination mechanism. We also have humanitarian country teams, HTCs, HCTs, humanitarian country teams. Then we have the third one, interagency standing committee, IASC, interagency standing committee. These are coordination structures that help to shape who decides priorities and how resources are allocated. We must take all this into consideration. So under this humanitarian coordination mechanism, we should also know that the humanitarian cluster system actually helps to organize humanitarian response by sectors. They will organize the responses by sectors. Example, maybe for health sector, the shelter and protection, and they are led by designated agencies. Then if you look at the second humanitarian coordination mechanism, which is the humanitarian country teams, HCT, what is their job? They are to take some strategic decision making, at country level, and they include UN agencies, NGOs, and even sometimes donors. These are the people that makes up the humanitarian country teams. Interagency standing committee are into global coordination and policy leadership. So in a nutshell, coordination structures will shape who decides priorities and how resources are allocated. Now let's look at humanitarian financing and power dynamics. Very important aspect. Humanitarian financing, this is a subtopic under what we are treating now. Humanitarian financing and power dynamics. What we must know is that, of course, humanitarian intervention is capital intensive. It is money that is involved. So the financing is a major driver of governance and equity. Take note of that. Humanitarian financing is a major driver. It's a major driver of governance and equity. And what are the key features of humanitarian financing and power dynamics? Because we should know that humanitarian funding, often flow from high-income donor countries. There are high-income donor countries that are major donors. But another thing we must know is that short-term funding, when you have short-term funding cycle, short-term funding cycle can limit long-term planning. That is, if people are just funding on a short-term basis, it will limit long-term planning basis. If you have long-term planning, it cannot be achieved when the funding cycles is coming on a short term. And of course, local actors receive a small share of direct funding. These are key features. So these dynamics can actually enforce power imbalances and undermine local leadership. There's something we quickly need to know. What about the aspect of accountability in humanitarian governance? Accountability in humanitarian governance, very important, because there is what we should understand quickly. Humanitarian leadership, one of the key aspects that involves a humanitarian leader to do that, he must be accountable. And there's what we call upward accountability, horizontal accountability, and downward accountability. These are the various forms of accountability in humanitarian governance. Because equitable governance will actually prioritize accountability to communities that are affected by crisis. That is very key. When you do upward accountability, it means that you, as a humanitarian leader, you are accountable to the donors and the institutions. That is upward accountability. If you do horizontal accountability, that means you are being accountable among partners. Then downward accountability is when you are accountable to affected populations. So even if you are providing some kind of intervention to affected populations, you have to still be accountable to them. So an ethical leader must be someone who is accountable upwardly, horizontally, and also downwardly. And equitable governance actually prioritize accountability to communities that are affected by crisis. You must prioritize it. When we talk about humanitarian leadership, we're talking about ethical humanitarian leadership. You must prioritize being accountable to the communities that you are serving. And what are the key accountability tools? Key accountability tools. Number one is what? Community feedback and complaint mechanism. You must create an opportunity for feedback and complaint. You must create an opportunity so that the community that is being affected by crisis must be accountable to. You must create an opportunity for them to provide feedback, create an opportunity for them to lay complaints wherever necessary. And you must do what we call participatory needs assessment in addition to transparency in decision making and resource use. Yes, these are key accountability tools. Now, in this same module 2, finally, before we shut down module 2, we should look at what? The roles again, because these roles of key stakeholders in humanitarian governance. The government, the civil society, the youth leaders, and the private sector. These are 4 major key stakeholders in humanitarian what? Yes. The governments have a role to play by ensuring that they lead national coordination and policy frameworks. Of course, government should ensure humanitarian access and protection and even balance sovereignty with international cooperation. The role of civil society will involve providing community-led insight and trust, and also hold institutions accountable. In addition to youth leaders, youth leaders' role is to support community mobilization and even communication. In addition to what? Private sectors must also contribute logistics, data, and innovation. Now, what are the case study here? The case study for module 2 is to look at humanitarian coordination during the Syrian crisis. We're taking it a little bit out of Africa. The Syrian crisis. That is, of course, we know that the Syrian humanitarian crisis actually highlighted some strengths and weaknesses in global humanitarian governance. What are the key challenges? We should know that political constraints on humanitarian access. There's political constraint when you politicize humanitarian intervention and make access very difficult. Of course, another challenge is fragmented coordination across borders, and limited inclusion of local organizations in decision making. There's something we quickly need to know here. Before global humanitarian actors can come to intervene, there are already some local intervention actors in any particular society. These local intervention actors, local intervention organizations, or local humanitarian organizations must have to be included. When you have limited inclusion of local organizations in decision making or in the resource planning within the scope of humanitarian intervention, then the impact will definitely be very, very poor. So take note of that. So what are the key takeaways from this module 2? Key takeaway is that the humanitarian system is complex and it is multi-layered. Yes, key takeaways. The humanitarian system is complex and it is multi-layered. And the second one is that power and financing actually shape governance and priorities. Yes, power and financing shape governance and priorities. And third takeaway is that coordination mechanisms actually influence equity and what? Effectiveness. If coordination mechanisms are not properly put in place, it will shape equity. It will disadvantage some people. It will make inequities to surface. And accountability to affected populations is central to legitimacy. Just like I said, accountability to affected population is key, because you are, for an effective humanitarian leader, must be accountable to the affected population. In addition to the fact that an effective humanitarian leader must be accountable to the donor organization, it must be accountable to partners, and it must also be accountable to what? The affected population or the affected society. Very important. And of course, inclusive leadership strengthens the humanitarian governance. Very, very important. Inclusive leadership strengthens humanitarian governance. So that is that for module 2. We shall be, like I said from the beginning of this training, it contains 10 modules that we are supposed to run for the entire 3 days. We have just done 2 modules, but we will be handling 4 modules today. We have just 2 modules to go, and by tomorrow we'll have to handle 3 modules, and by next tomorrow we'll conclude the remaining 3 modules. So we have just handled module 1 and 2. We will quickly be going to module 3. Module 3 here, we will be looking at leadership ethics, leadership values, and even decision making in humanitarian context. We are talking about ethical leadership, leadership that is, that is result oriented, leadership that's, that is generally accepted. Okay. Yes. So that is what module 3 we'll be talking about. Looking at ethical dilemmas in humanitarian action and what have you. Now, as we progress, I want us to quickly take a 5-minute break, just so that for those of us who are sitting, we may have to stretch our legs, just for like 5 minutes only, and we will commence back by 5:00. Commence again by 5:10. That is by 10 minutes past 5. This is 5 minutes past 5. So we will commence again we'll continue in the next 5 minutes. 10 minutes past 5. That's how we commence. So that we can stretch our legs. Thank you very much. And thanks for staying with us. All right, thank you very much, each and every one of us, and welcome back from the short break. We will continue with module 3 of this very all-important training on humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. Let us quickly proceed by looking at module 3, where we said we will be talking about leadership ethics, values, and decision-making in humanitarian context. We are trying to say that humanitarian leaders routinely face high-stakes ethical dilemmas. There are high-stakes ethical dilemmas in environments. Environments that are marked by urgency, environments that are marked by insecurity, political pressure, and even limited resources. So there are some decisions that ethical leaders must make under certain conditions that determine who receives assistance and how resources are allocated and whether humanitarian principles are being upheld. Don't forget that the average humanitarian leader is guided by the core principles of humanitarianism, which involves impartiality, independence, and what have you that we've actually looked at. So he must also ensure that there is principles of humanity and the neutrality and impartiality must be upheld. These core principles of humanitarianism. So this very module, we want to explore how ethical leadership, values-based decision making, and even accountability in humanitarian context, and how we can equip participants to navigate complexity, while maintaining, you have to maintain integrity and trust. Now, what are the ethical dilemmas in humanitarian action? That is the first thing you need to ask yourself, because ethical dilemmas actually arise when leaders must choose between competing moral obligations, often with incomplete information. When you have moral obligation that is coming in between decisions you are supposed to take, you have to make decisions that balances moral obligations and also balances humanitarian principles. They call humanitarian principles. Some of these common ethical challenges involve when you have to choose between speed and accountability. When you have to, when you see that taking some speedy decisions can actually affect accountability, or when you look at the fact that taking certain humanitarian decisions will affect your ability to account for what you have done. So you have this as an ethical challenge. And when you find yourself as an ethical leader trying to negotiate access, when you are trying to negotiate access with armed actors, that becomes another ethical dilemma. When you are trying to negotiate access with armed actors, when you are trying to balance staff safety, that means the safety of your staff, and you are trying to balance it with the needs of the beneficiary. That means with the needs of the affected community. So you have to. These are common ethical challenges. And of course, another one is when you allocating scarce resources among competing needs. When you are allocating scarce resources, how do you allocate these resources in such a way that it does not treat anyone unfairly, it does not bring any form of inequity, or it does not cause any form of, anybody does not feel marginalized, and you make sure that there is fair access. These are some of the ethical challenges humanitarian leaders usually face. And sometimes when you are operating in politically sensitive environments, how do you, this is also another common ethical challenge. So ethical leadership actually requires a reflection. It requires transparency and principled judgment, rather than rigid rules. These are some of the things we need to look at. That is what module 3 here is talking about. We also consider an aspect we call values-based leadership under pressure. That is leadership that is based on moral values. Leadership that is not based on just your personal interest. So under pressure, people can be, humanitarian leaders can be mistakenly or coerced or forced to take certain decisions that may not reflect core humanitarian values. Because when we are talking about values-based leadership, it is about making decisions in core humanitarian principles and moral commitments. These values-based values-based leadership under pressure, it has to do with when you have respect for human dignity, when you have equity and fairness, when you have integrity and honesty, and you have a responsibility towards affected populations. So leaders must act consistently with values that will boost credibility, even in difficult circumstances. So these are some of the things we need to take into consideration. Then the area of decision making in complex and high risk environments. Yes, this is another common ethical dilemma. Decision making in complex and high risk environments, because humanitarian leaders must make decisions under uncertainty. They must make decisions under time pressure and also under risk. Sometimes the decisions has to be speedy. It has to be quick because of limited time, and these decisions have to be accurate. So the key decision-making considerations for ethical leaders include decisions that have to do with who is most affected by this decision. As an ethical leader, before you take any form of decisions under uncertainty, under time pressure, and under risk, you have to ask yourself, who is the most affected by this decision? You ask yourself again, what are the short and long-term consequences? You consider the short and long-term consequences of the decisions, and you have to look at how does your decision align with humanitarian principles. These are the key decision-making considerations that humanitarian leaders must make. Then, of course, you look at another consideration that has to do with what risk exists to people, to partnerships, and even to trust. So because structured ethical decision making will help leaders navigate complexity responsibly. So very, very important. Then we have talked about values-based leadership under pressure. We have just discussed decision making in complex and high-risk environment. Then we should also look at accountability to affected populations. If you are with me, you will discover that accountability to affected populations, I am mentioning this for the third time. That is to show you the degree of importance that accountability to affected institutions is being attached. Because ethical leadership must prioritize accountability, not only to donors and institutions, but also to those receiving assistance. Yes, and some of the practices that you must do to strengthen accountability has to do with community consultations and participation. Yes, and you must consult the community. You must make sure that the community, there's full participation. Then you must do some kind of transparent communication about decisions and limitations. That shows that you are being accountable to the affected communities. You must create a feedback and complaint mechanism from the community. And you must also have respect for local norms, local culture, and also respect for their local leadership, because accountability enhances the legitimacy and effectiveness of humanitarian action. So these are some of the things that must be taken into consideration. Then, of course, we will look at another key aspect, which is the aspect of managing trade-offs, like access, security, and principles. Because sometimes humanitarian leaders often face what we call trade-offs between gaining access to affected populations, ensuring staff safety, and also upholding neutrality and independence. So ethical leadership must ensure that careful judgment is made, open leadership and organizational support to manage these tensions responsibly. These are very important. So, of course, we will quickly look at the roles of key stakeholders in ethical humanitarian leadership. And these key stakeholders, like we have been saying it from the beginning, have to do with the government, the civil society organizations, the youth leaders, and also the private sector. These are key stakeholders. And the role of the government in ethical humanitarian leadership is to create enabling legal and policy environment that will effect ethical humanitarian leadership. The government, of course, we know that they have to play a key role through principles, through legal and policies. So that is the role that government can play, and to support ethical coordination frameworks. And of course, the next key holder of, key stakeholders, which has to do with civil society organizations, they are to uphold community-centered accountability. They are also to advocate for ethical standards and also to model principled leadership. Youth leaders can contribute their role. Their own play a role by promoting transparency and also ethical innovation, and even challenging unjust practices. These are some of the role of youth leaders, and supporting inclusive decision making. Private sectors can play the role of promoting transparency and ethical innovation, in addition to applying ethical standards in partnership and supply chains, avoiding actions that exacerbate conflict or inequality, and supporting responsible innovation. Now, to end up module 3, we will look at a case study here, a case study that has to do with ethical decision making in access negotiations. That means in a conflict-affected country, humanitarian leaders are often faced with pressure to negotiate access with armed groups accused of human rights abuses. That means there are some armed groups that are accused of human rights abuses. You will see that humanitarian leaders are often faced with the pressure of negotiating with them so as to get access to affected communities. And now the key ethical questions here that normally comes is, how does engagement with armed groups compromise neutrality? Yes, if the ethical leaders engage with armed groups in order to negotiate access to affected communities, does it compromise neutrality? Because ethical leaders are supposed to be neutral. They are not supposed to take sides. So engaging with armed groups, does it mean that they are taking sides? So these are key ethical questions. And another key ethical question is that the aspect of can assistance reach civilians without strengthening armed actors? Yes, that is another key ethical question. And another one is, how are the staff and community safety ensured? How can you ensure the safety of your staff and the safety of the community? These are key ethical questions. But the leadership lessons that we must learn out of this is that ethical dilemmas require collective deliberation, because it is very important. Transparency and documentation are critical, and of course, community perspectives must inform decision making. Now, to end up module 3, we will look at the key takeaways. What are the key takeaways from module 3? In case you have not been listening in other parts of the training, it is very important to know that these key takeaways can summarize some of what the entire module 3 is talking about. And what we are saying is, one of the key takeaways is that ethical dilemmas are inherent in humanitarian leadership. Okay? Ethical dilemmas are inherent in humanitarian leadership. That is one. Number 2, values-based leadership strengthens trust and legitimacy. That means leadership or ethical leadership that is based on moral values can strengthen trust and legitimacy. And we talked about the third takeaway, that accountability to affected populations is central. We have said it, and this is one of the takeaways. Then, of course, decision making requires balancing principles, risk, and realities. These are the key takeaways. And in addition to that, ethical leadership is a continuous practice, not a one-time practice, not a one-time choice. That is what leads us to the end of module 3. And of course, we will quickly be looking at the last module for today, which will now talk about module 4, where we'll be looking at equity, inclusion, and social justice in humanitarian action. Here we are getting closer to that global equity governance, the global equity governance component of this particular training, which is very, very important. We are looking at equity, inclusion, and social justice in humanitarian action, because We should, like we have always said from the beginning, and I've been repeating it, that humanitarian crises do not affect all people equally. So there's inequality, there's discrimination and exclusion. Some of all these things can shape who is most vulnerable, and it can also decide who receives assistance and whose voices are heard in decision making. So it's very important to take note that humanitarian leadership must be grounded, like we have said from the beginning. Humanitarian leadership must be grounded in what? In equity, it must be grounded in inclusion, and it must be grounded in what? Social justice. Because it will, why should it be so? The essence is to ensure that you don't only respond to immediate needs, but you should also address structural barriers that give birth to vulnerability. Now, this very module 4 is actually trying to make us explore how humanitarian leaders can promote inclusive, equitable, and justice-oriented approaches, in policy, programming, and even governance. Yes, how you as a humanitarian leader, how you can promote inclusive, inclusive, equitable, and justice-oriented approaches in policy, programming, and governance. Now, let us quickly move to an aspect that is also key as far as this very training is concerned, and that is the aspect we call inequality and structural injustice in humanitarian context. Inequality and structural injustice in humanitarian context. We should not forget that some people are disadvantaged already because of, structural inequalities. When we are talking about structural inequalities, we are talking about poverty, discrimination, disability, ethnicity, and even legal status. You understand? Because some of these things determine exposure to crisis and access to assistance. There are some kind of inequalities that are structural. When we say they are structural, that means they are already embedded in our society. They are already embedded in the way the society is structured. Poverty is actually structural because some policies that are on ground actually, to a very large extent, ensure that there's poverty in the land. When you have policies and principles and norms of a society that entrenches gender discrimination, it entrenches disability and ethnicity, that is structural. These are various forms of structural inequalities, and these kind of structural inequalities can determine exposure to crisis and even access to assistance. Because the moment you are structurally disadvantaged, it affects the kind of assistance you are going to get. Just the way we were looking at the level of COVID-19 humanitarian intervention that took place, we saw that there were people who had higher access to vaccines than other set of people. And the people that had less access to vaccines were actually people who were disadvantaged minorities, people who were actually poor, and people who were actually disadvantaged people of the society. So what we are trying to say here is that, some of the key dimensions of inequality can actually be maybe gender or age-based exclusion. People are excluded on the basis of gender or the basis of their age. People are actually excluded on the basis of disability and even accessibility. People are marginalized because they are minorities and they are even displaced populations. We have also legal and documentation barriers. So humanitarian leaders must recognize that vulnerability is socially constructed. Yes, take that again. Vulnerability is socially constructed. That means it is socially created. The level of vulnerability that you have to a particular risk is different from the kind of vulnerability the other person has. Probably because the other person is not affected by the social construct that has marginalized the other party. Are we together? So as that is very important. So humanitarian leaders must maintain fairness in making sure that there is equal access to resources, equal access to assistance, equal access to help during during humanitarian crisis. So the humanitarian action itself must not be discriminatory. Humanitarian action must not be one-sided. That is what humanitarian leadership and global equity governance is talking about. Because you as a humanitarian leader, an ethical humanitarian leader, you must recognize that vulnerability is socially created. It is not accidental. So there must be inclusion of marginalized and at-risk groups, because inclusive humanitarian actions ensure that assistance reaches those most in need, and it even respects diversity. Those most in need. There are specific groups that require targeted inclusion. Yes, people like groups like women and girls, groups like children and youth, persons with disabilities, older persons, refugees, IDPs, and stateless populations. These specific groups. So inclusion requires intentional design. Inclusion requires outreach and even what? Participation. We have treated something like this in one of our trainings on diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is also an integral part of humanitarian action, ensuring that groups, some of these groups have to be included. These are groups that must be targeted for inclusion. Women and girls, children and youth, persons with disabilities, older persons, refugees, IDPs, and even stateless populations. So, and it must be intentional. The humanitarian action the design must be intentional, the outreach must be intentional, and the participation must take note of them. So, of course, let us look at another aspect of gender, age, and diversity mainstreaming. Yes, mainstreaming equity actually means that you have to integrate inclusion across all stages of humanitarian action, just like I've said before. And what are the key practices? You must do some kind of gender and age-sensitive needs assessment. You must do inclusive program design and implementation. Your program design must be the type that is inclusive of all gender. And of course, you must do what we call data disaggregation by sex, by age, and even disability. And you must even train your staff. That means if you are a humanitarian leader, you have a team, you must ensure that you train your staff on diversity and inclusion. If your staff are not trained on diversity and inclusion, it becomes very difficult to mainstream age, gender, and diversity into humanitarian action. So mainstreaming actually prevents exclusion and improves effectiveness. That is what we must get very clearly here. So the next aspect we must look at is what? Community participation and localization. These are all aspects that has to do with equity, inclusion, and social justice in humanitarian action. This is what Module 4 is talking about. Community participation and localization is another aspect, because equitable humanitarian leadership must center on affected communities. We must see affected communities as partners, not passive recipients. And what are the key elements of meaningful participation? That means there should be some kind of community consultation and co-design. That means the humanitarian leadership must design any form of humanitarian response in conjunction with the community. That is how to do what we call meaningful participation. There must be support for local leadership and institutions. There must be respect for cultural norms and knowledge, and there should be feedback and accountability mechanisms. We have discussed this before, but these are some of the key elements of meaningful participation, because we know that localization strengthens legitimacy and sustainability. If the affected communities are not carried along, if the affected communities are not meaningfully included and in the whole process, then the humanitarian action itself will lack legitimacy, and it will even lack sustainability, because they are the ones that will own the whole process at the end of the day. Now, we should also look at addressing power imbalances between global and local actors. Yes, When we are talking about the humanitarian system, the global humanitarian system and global humanitarian infrastructure or architecture, we talk about the global actors, we talk about national actors, state actors, and local actors. We should know that there is usually global imbalances that often limit local influence over funding. It limits the over leadership and even priorities. So there should be some kind of equity-focused leadership action, because you must even global leaders should share decision-making authority. As an ethical humanitarian leader, you must support direct funding to local actors. You must also invest in local capacity and leadership development, in addition to promoting mutual accountability. Because equitable governance requires shifting power, not just shifting rhetorics. So these are some of the things that global equity governance is talking about. And finally, we should look at the roles of key stakeholders in promoting equity and inclusion. Do not forget that we have always tried to ensure that we talk about the importance of collaboration across sectors, in terms of achieving an effective and efficient coordination and global humanitarian action. And that starts with the government. We talked about civil society. They all have a role to play, youth leaders and the private sector. Now, what are the key roles of stakeholders like this in promoting equity and inclusion? The government must enact inclusive humanitarian policies. They must ensure protection of marginalized groups, and they must support participation in localization. That is the role the government should play. The civil society have the role of representing community voices, advocating for social justice, and even delivering inclusive and community-driven services. Youth leaders have the key role to play of what? Of promoting inclusion and social responsibility. Even mobilizing marginalized youth and innovating participatory approaches. And of course, the private sector also have a role to play by ensuring that inclusive service delivery and employment, applying ethical and non-discriminatory practices, and even supporting accessibility and innovation. These are some of the things. Now, let's not look at a case study in this module 4 before we round up the training for today, because we are stopping at module 4. Inclusive humanitarian programming for persons with disabilities, for example. How do you come up with inclusive humanitarian programming for persons with disabilities? Because in a post-disaster setting, in an after-disaster setting, we know that humanitarian agencies redesign shelter and services to include persons with disabilities. That is very important. And what are the key actions? The key actions involve disability inclusive needs assessment. That means you must assess the needs of the disabled population. You must assess their needs and integrate their needs into the humanitarian program you are designing. It must be intentional. And of course, there's what we call accessible infrastructure design. It must be inclusive. And of course, there must be inclusion of disability organization in the planning. If you have organizations that represent disability people, they must be included in the planning and designing of humanitarian programs. And the outcome will be what? We end up having an outcome of increased access to services, improved dignity and participation, and stronger community trust. What are the key lessons? Is that inclusion actually improves effectiveness, not just fairness. Yes. And local expertise enhances program design. That means those who are local key stakeholders, local NGO leaders, local humanitarian actors, and local humanitarian leaders have to be included. They have to be carried along. So in conclusion to module 4, what are the key takeaways? Very simple. Inequality, like we have said from the beginning, shapes vulnerability and access. Yes, because people are affected disproportionately. People are not affected in the same manner by humanitarian crisis. And we know that inclusion must be intentional. It must not be systemic. In as much as we have systemic causes of vulnerability, then of course, community participation is central to equity. The community, the affected community must be included. They must be part of the process. And power imbalances normally undermines effectiveness. So equity must strengthen humanitarian legitimacy and what? Impact. So when there's equity, it will strengthen humanitarian legitimacy and impact. This is what Module 4 actually contains. And this will lead us to the end of our training for today. Like I said, this particular course contains 10 modules. We are to cover 4 modules today, which we have just done. We will cover the remaining 6 modules tomorrow and next tomorrow, same time by 4 p.m. For now, before we shut down the training for today, I will give an opportunity for interactive session. Those of us who have questions, if you don't have questions, you may have contribution. Or if you have a story that someone may also benefit that comes from your area, you have the opportunity to speak. We have a coordinated approach when we want to create an inclusive, participation here, so to speak. You raise your hand. When you raise your hand, I will pick you. Once I call you, then you will now speak. You know, and when you are speaking, you don't nobody interrupts until you are done. So thank you very much, and I want to believe we have all enjoyed the training. It's been nice having you people. So the floor is actually open. Anybody that has contribution or questions or comments, you have the floor. You start by raising up your hand, and you will be picked. I will need to appoint you before you speak. Thank you very much. Yes, the floor is open. The floor is open. No questions? No. Okay, I can see one person's hand is up. That is Ibrahim Makiga. Mr. Ibrahim Makiga, you have the floor. Make it brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for the presentation. I am Ibrahim Abubakar Makiga. So I really enjoyed the lecture. So I just need more explanation on that horizontal accountability, sir.
Okay.
I know you mentioned we have upward, horizontal, and downward. So I just need more information on the horizontal. Thank you, sir.
Okay, that is very good. Yes, we have been speaking about the importance. We made mention of the importance of, ethical humanitarian leadership, which has to do with the fact that accountability is key. It is one of the core principles that an ethical humanitarian leader should always imbibe. And we mentioned accountability. And we said that somebody who does not understand this may think that the person is supposed to be accountable only to donors. That means accountable to the funders, which is upward accountability. And he is not only accountable to the donors, which is what we call upward accountability. He is also supposed to be accountable downwards. That is downward accountability, which has to do with being accountable to the affected community. Then horizontal accountability is the type of accountability that involves in being accountable to partners, being accountable horizontally, being accountable to partners and collaborators and the other affiliates on the same level. That is what we mean by horizontal accountability. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
You're
thank you, sir.
So it's very important. We know some of these things. And Mr. Ibrahim Makiga, once your question has been answered, you need to bring down your hand so that we will not think that your hand is still up for another question. So if we have any other questions, let us quickly know before we shut down the training. If there's any aspect you are not clear about, uh, uh, I can see a lot of people saying, thank you for the great insights. Thank you for the presentation. This is impactful. Kindly share the slide in the group. Of course, the slide for this training and even the course material is very comprehensive. For those of us who are involved in one form of humanitarian work or the other, or for those of us who have NGOs, or if you are actually studying disaster and risk management, if you are involved in humanitarian and rehabilitation studies, and in case it's an aspect that you want to go into, the material itself will be very rich and very useful. But of course, this material and the slide will actually be given only to those who are going to back the certificates, those who want to get the certificate of this training. Of course, it comes with the slide, it comes with the material. You could actually step down the training to your staff and others. So I want to believe that we are all satisfied with the training for today. This will actually, I think I am forced to shut down the training so that we can all go and rest, and we'll meet again tomorrow by 4 p.m. For the second phase of this all-important course on humanitarian leadership and global equity governance. Thank you all very much for your time, and have a wonderful evening, and God bless you.